In my hands, I have two Tamron zoom lenses for Sony E mount, the 50 to 300 millimeter and the 50 to 400 millimeter. I bought them both with my own money, but I'm only going to keep one, so join me in this adventure as we test the hell out of these lenses. We're going to be doing image quality tests, real world tests. We're going to look at the bells and whistles, the features, the physical differences. We're going to put these lenses through its paces.
Now on my channel, I frequently review all-in-one bridge cameras with the zoom lenses built in, but that category is starting to die out. So I wanted to find some really good quality zoom lenses. Tamron makes a lot of zoom lenses with overlapping focal lengths. Now the 70 to 300 is an older lens, so it has the older technology. Plus 70 millimeters isn't that wide.
50 millimeters is a focal length which would be okay for carrying around all day. You don't have to change lenses, simulating what a bridge camera would be like.
Tamron just announced a 28 to 300 millimeters to make it even more confusing, but the initial test chart results look like some compromises had to be made, so we're going to stick to the 50 to 300 and 50 to 400. They both have the same aperture, 4.5 to 6.3. The 400 is considerably heavier, longer, and more expensive. And they both do extend when they're zoomed. The 300 goes a little more than 8 inches and the 400 a little more than around 10 inches, so about 2 inches longer, just so you know. Now looking at the lenses side by side, they're both attractive with a similar solid construction. The size and weight difference of the 50 to 400 is very apparent in your hands. You definitely can feel the difference. And here is what they look like on two similar camera bodies, an A7R5 and an A1. Now the difference in size between these two cameras means you're probably going to need different camera bags. The 50 to 300 can fit in this nice, reasonably sized camera bag.
But try putting the big one in. Wait a minute, I didn't mean it how it sounded.
You sick pervert!
And as you can see, that same bag that easily fit the 50 to 300.
It doesn't fit, it's too big.
So just realize if you're going to be walking around with the camera all day, well, you're going to feel it with a lens that heavy. So let's start with the similarities between these lenses. Tamron likes to keep the filter threads uniform across their lenses, 67 millimeters, both weather sealed, both have image stabilization, no tripod collars, and they're not compatible with Sony teleconverters. They both use the VXD autofocus system by Tamron. So let's take a look at how the autofocus does. Here it is on the 50 to 300 millimeters, and I'm showing you the rear screen to show you how quickly the lens does acquire the eye. Now this is using Sony's A7R5, which does have a very snappy autofocus system, and you can see it's working really well. Equally well, I would say, with the 50 to 400 millimeter lens, again on the Sony A7R5, acquires the eye very quickly. As I move laterally and try to cover my face, it reacquires it very quickly. So hard to fool this lens. Now out to the zoo, this is through a glass window. It did capture this tiger pretty well with all the obstructions and the trees. It seemed to kind of understand what I wanted to focus on. Again, this is kudos to the Sony and the lens, but it's important that the lens does work well with the Sony camera, Sony autofocus system. Here it loses the focus just temporarily, but captures it again. So pretty snappy, I would say. This is a pretty tough scene where other lenses and cameras would totally lose the focus. And again, this is through glass too. The zoom rings on both lenses, I'd say, are very well dampened, turn smoothly, however, responsively. 50 to 300 has a programmable focus hold button and a lock button to prevent creep.
So you are a creep.
The 50 to 400 also has that lock button, but in addition there are lots of other buttons and switches. 2 switches for vibration compensation. There's also 2 programmable custom buttons which can be used with the Tamron free lens utility, and you use the weather-sealed USB-C connection for that. The plastic lens hoods have a slightly different design. Actually, the 50 to 300 is a little bigger, and here is what it looks like when they're attached to the lenses on the camera. Now, both lenses have the same f4.5 to 6.3 aperture, but I want to show you that the 50 to 300 stays at f4.5 longer, up to 69 millimeters versus 60 on the 400, and the 300 millimeters goes to its slowest aperture at 181 millimeters versus 151 on the 50 to 400. So you stay a little bit brighter, a little longer. So the aperture wars, the winner is the 50 to 300. Now, both lenses also offer some very close or near macro capabilities, but again, there's a little bit of a difference. Now, I took this shot with the 50-300, but due to all the pixels in the A7R5, I was able to crop in enough to get a 1-to-1 reproduction, and I was pretty buzzed about this.
Oh, that's not funny. That's not funny.
The closer 1-to-2 macro reproduction for both lenses at the wide end. You also get some macro reproduction at the tele end if you want longer working distance from those insects, and you get a little better results with the 50-300, so it wins in this department as well.
So 400 is 1/3 bigger than 300, but 300 is only 25% shorter than 400. So how does this all shake out in reality?
So we're going to use this cityscape to demonstrate. Here is 50 millimeters full wide, and we're going to zoom up on this little point here. This is 300 millimeters and the 400 millimeter lens. Now, if you put it on an APS-C camera, you would get actually 600 millimeters. That's because there's a 1.5 times crop on an APS-C sensor, but of course the lens looks very long on such a small body like the A6400. But if you're going to use the lenses on a full frame camera, which most people are, here's the difference. This is why you're paying extra money for that extra reach and extra weight.
So let's zero in now on image sharpness, but do me one quick favor. I'm not going to ask you to smash the like button because I don't want you to damage your computer or phone, but you can just gently hit it and it would really help the channel. Lots more videos on the way.
So here's the 50-300 millimeters at 50 millimeters wide open at f4.5, and here is the 50-400 millimeters, and they're very close. Let's crop in now, and we're going to look at the 50-300 millimeters, and we're going to take a look at this. Still looks good, still looks nice and sharp. 50-400 millimeters. I'll be damned. Wow, these really do look close. I mean, maybe some of you are better pixel peepers, but tell me what you think. Now, many times lenses have problems in the corners, so we're in the corners of the frame. Here's the 50-300 millimeters. Let's pay attention to the tree here. And the 50-400 may look a little softer here. We'll go to f8, where lenses are usually the sharpest. Again, this is the corner. This is the 50-300. Now we'll look at the 50-400, and they're, again, just about even now. I do consider these differences really small, but I know some of you are very concerned about it. Let's look at the long end. Here's the 50-300 millimeters wide open at f6.3. Now when we switch to the bigger lens, here I'm seeing a little more contrast and possibly a little more sharpness. So I would say this is probably the biggest difference I've seen so far, even though it's not a huge difference. Let's crop in. So here is the 300 millimeters cropped in at 300 millimeters. And when we go to the 400 millimeter lens, again, we can confirm that there's more contrast in the picture. I think it looks a little sharper. So this is probably the biggest difference I've seen so far. But when we stop the lenses down to f8, here's the 50-300 millimeters at 300 millimeters cropped in at f8. And here's the 50-400 millimeter cropped in. You really don't see a difference anymore. So it really tightens up. And one more time, just the focal length difference between these two lenses. Here is the 300 millimeters at full zoom versus the 400 millimeters at full zoom, so you can see how much tighter you're actually getting with the bigger lens. And here's the 50-400 millimeters cropped in at 400 millimeters. It still retains a sharpness. You really can get in tight, and here you're starting to look like a telescope. I mean, to put it in perspective, this is how far back it is, so you really have a lot of reach.
Most Sony cameras now have built-in image stabilization, and I'm often asked, does the Tamron stabilization work in conjunction with the Sony's? And the answer is, well, not really. Generally, you need a Sony lens with built-in image stabilization so they understand each other. But the VC, what they call this vibration compensation in the Tamron lenses, is pretty effective, and you can actually use it on an APS-C camera that doesn't have image stabilization, such as the Sony A6400, which I tested it on.
So to demonstrate the stabilization, I'm using my A7R5 full zoom, hand holding it at 300 millimeters on the 50-300 millimeter lens. You can get an idea. There is some movement. It's not perfectly steady at all. But if you turn off the vibration compensation on the lens, it will turn it off in the camera too. So here it is on the 400 millimeters. And it's an absolute mess. I can't watch this. I don't want to get my audience nauseous. Sorry about that, but I just wanted to show you how it works. Now, the 400 millimeters, because of its heavier weight and longer reach, is harder to keep steady when you're zooming at handheld. I tried VC1 versus VC2, and they both give you this kind of like robot back and forth motion, not really steady.
Tamron suggests using the VC1 mode for general use, and the VC2 is for panning. So I would just recommend, for the most part, leave it in VC1.
Some older Sony bodies don't have built-in image stabilization like this A6400. Let's take a look at this building. This is with it turned off on the lens, the stabilization off, and here it is turned on, VC1 on the lens, and it's stabilizing it even though the camera doesn't have in-body stabilization. This is the 50 to 300 millimeters wide angle focus breathing test. Here it is at telephoto. I really don't see an issue. Or on the 50 to 400, this is at wide angle focus breathing, and this is telephoto. Now let's get out in the real world. Here are some shots with the 50 to 400 first.
Across the street.
So before we say an Irish goodbye, what's the verdict? What's the lens to get?
Is that extra 100 millimeters worth the extra size, price, and weight? And I think that depends upon how you're going to use the lens. If you're going to be carrying it around all the time, maybe like in a street photography setting, or if you're using it for travel on a vacation, then the extra weight you're going to start to feel. But maybe if you're on a safari or doing wildlife and it's going to be on a tripod most of the time, or you're carrying it in and out of your car so you're not carrying it on your shoulder, then it may not be a big deal. For me, I'm going to go with the 50 to 300 millimeter lens because I personally wind up carrying it around most of the time, and the 400 is a little too heavy. And since I'm shooting on a Sony A7R5 with 61 megapixels, and lots of other Sony cameras also have high megapixels, I can crop in. So the 300 millimeters can easily become 400, 500, or even 600 millimeters because of that high megapixel count. But it's a personal decision. Both are great lenses. I hope you got something out of this video. Please do subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. And I'd like your comments. This was my first lens review. Do you want to see more reviews of lenses? Let me know.